Everyone thinks Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden as a punishment, right? But what if I told you it wasn't a punishment at all? What if it was actually a rescue mission? This one idea flips the entire story of Genesis on its head. We've always been taught that Eden was a paradise lost because the people couldn't follow one simple rule. But if you look closer, the story isn't about a failed test or a divine overreaction. The expulsion from Eden doesn't look like revenge. It looks like the most merciful act in the entire Bible. Let's break down the biggest assumption we all make, that Eden was just a test of obedience. The story we're told is simple. God gives a command, humans disobey, punishment follows. But the actual text focuses on something much deeper: awareness, fear, shame, and separation. Think about it. When Adam and Eve eat the fruit, the garden doesn't disappear. Lightning doesn't strike. What changes is inside them. Their entire consciousness shifts, and their inner world fractures. Before the fruit, the Bible says they were naked and felt no shame. This isn't just about being comfortable with their bodies. It means there was no self-consciousness, no inner critic judging their every move. They existed in a state of complete unity, where who they were and what they did were one and the same. Eden wasn't about luxury. It was about this profound inner wholeness. The moment they eat the fruit, everything changes. The text says their eyes were open. But what did they see? Not some grand cosmic truth. They saw themselves. They saw their own nakedness. For the first time, they became objects of their own judgment. This is the birth of self-alienation, the moment the human mind learned to stand outside of itself and find itself lacking. And here's the most important part. Shame appears before God does. They don't feel ashamed because God is angry. They feel ashamed because their own minds have turned against them. They hide before God ever speaks a word of accusation. The eating of the fruit didn't just break a rule. It fundamentally rewired human consciousness. They didn't just learn that evil existed. They began to experience themselves as potentially evil. This is where the traditional interpretation falls apart. If the only problem was disobedience, a simple correction would have been enough, a second chance inside the garden. But that's not what happens. Instead, God makes a statement that sounds almost like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. This isn't a statement of anger. It's a statement of fact. Something irreversible has happened. So why kick them out? This is the plot twist. Look at what God is trying to prevent. He says he must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Now, hang on. Living forever in paradise sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? Not anymore. Imagine being trapped for eternity in this new state of consciousness, a state of shame, self-judgment, fear, and internal division. Living forever wouldn't be paradise. It would be an unending psychological nightmare, a spiritual prison with no escape. The expulsion wasn't a punishment. It was an act of profound compassion. God wasn't locking them out of paradise. He was locking them out of hell. By introducing mortality, by giving them an exit, he was giving humanity a chance to heal, a chance to navigate this broken consciousness in a finite world with the hope of eventual restoration. The gates of Eden weren't closed to keep humanity out. They were closed to contain a catastrophe and to set the stage for the greatest rescue story ever told. It completely reframes how we see the beginning of everything. But there's a line in Genesis that changes everything. A sentence that almost never gets the attention it deserves. After Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, God says they must not be allowed to eat from the tree of life and live forever. This is the key. This is the hinge on which the entire story turns, because it reveals the real danger. The danger wasn't just that humans disobeyed. The danger was that humans, now fractured and broken on the inside, could become immortal in that state. Just think about what that would mean. A being with infinite life, but also unresolved fear. Endless existence combined with shame, blame, anxiety, and alienation. An eternal consciousness trapped in a broken psychological loop. That's not paradise. That's hell. A conscious, self-aware, morally burdened existence with no escape, no healing, and no end. This reframes the expulsion entirely. God doesn't drive humans out because he's offended. He drives them out because they're now vulnerable. The garden wasn't safe anymore. Not because God changed, but because humans did. Eden required a certain kind of innocence, a unity of self. Once that internal division entered the human mind, the garden became incompatible with human survival. And notice what God does next. He makes garments for Adam and Eve, not flimsy leaves, but durable coverings of skin. This is the very first thing he does after the judgment. Before the exile, before the toil, before the pain, there's care. God responds to their new feeling of shame not with more exposure, but with covering. That detail alone should make us rethink the tone of the entire scene. This isn't a deity reveling in punishment. This is a parent responding to a catastrophic developmental shift in their child. The expulsion itself is often imagined as this dramatic, violent event, but the text is surprisingly restrained. God simply sends them out. He places cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the way back, not to torment them, but specifically to prevent re-entry. The sword isn't chasing humanity. It's blocking the path to the tree of life, the one thing that would have frozen them forever in a damaged state. This is where a rescue mission interpretation becomes almost unavoidable, because once you see the tree of life as the immediate threat, everything else falls into place. Mortality becomes a mercy, time becomes a gift, history becomes a healing process, not a punishment cycle. Suddenly, death is no longer just a curse, it's a limit placed on brokenness. Imagine if your deepest fears could never end, if regret could never fade, if your trauma could never resolve because existence itself never stopped. Mortality allows for renewal. It allows for new generations. It allows for learning, growth, repentance, and transformation. It allows the story to continue. Without death, humanity would have been locked in an eternal present, defined by its very first round. This also explains why the biblical narrative doesn't just end at Eden. If the expulsion were simply punishment, the story could stop right there. Humans failed. God judged. The end. But instead, the entire rest of the Bible is about restoration. It's about learning to walk with God outside the garden. It's about finding wisdom in a fractured world. It's about the long journey to a state where eternal life is no longer dangerous, because that inner fracture has finally been healed. This is why the tree of life reappears at the very end of the Bible in Revelation. Access is restored, but only after transformation, only after healing, only after the internal condition that made Eden unsafe has been addressed. Eternity isn't withheld forever. It's just delayed until humanity is ready for it. When you read Genesis this way, God doesn't look petty or reactive. He looks cautious, protective, almost surgical in his response. He limits human power at the exact moment our self-awareness becomes unstable. That's not punishment. That's containment. Even the consequences that follow the toil, the pain, the difficulty take on a different tone. They aren't arbitrary curses designed just to make life miserable. They are the realities of existence outside the perfect garden, the conditions under which we must now grow, struggle, and mature. Work becomes meaningful. Childbirth becomes costly. Life becomes serious. These are the very conditions under which wisdom develops. It's a profound shift in perspective, one that turns a story of punishment into a story of protection and eventual healing. And notice something else. God continues to interact with humanity after Eden. He doesn't just abandon them. He walks with Cain. He protects him, even after a terrible act. He grieves over human violence before the flood. He chooses Abraham. He enters into covenants. None of this fits the story of a God who just expelled humanity in a fit of rage. It fits the narrative of a God who relocated humanity into a different phase of their development. In that sense, Eden was never meant to be permanent. It was just the beginning. Think of it like a womb, not a final destination, and like all wombs, it must be left for growth to truly happen. The tragedy isn't that Adam and Eve left Eden. The real tragedy would have been if they had never left at all, staying in a state of eternal infancy. This perspective also completely reframes the idea of human suffering. Pain isn't evidence that God has abandoned humanity. It's evidence that humanity is living in a world where freedom, choice, and real growth are possible. Sure, Eden was safe, but it was also static. Nothing ever changed. Outside of Eden, history begins to unfold. Art emerges, culture forms, love becomes risky and therefore more profound. Faith becomes meaningful because it requires a choice. None of that can exist in a perfect garden where nothing can ever go wrong. So, when we reduce the Eden story to a simple act of disobedience, we miss the incredible depth of what's being described. The book of Genesis isn't primarily about breaking rules. It's about the birth of consciousness. It's about the emergence of moral awareness and the heavy cost that comes with that awareness. It's about what happens when innocence is lost and responsibility begins. The real reason Adam and Eve couldn't stay in Eden isn't because God was angry. It's because they were no longer the same beings they were before. The garden didn't change. They did, and keeping them there would have trapped humanity in an eternal state of psychological conflict, forever caught between innocence and knowledge. Seen this way, the expulsion from the garden isn't the fall of humanity into meaninglessness. It's the start of the long, challenging road back to wholeness, a road that requires time, mortality, struggle, and grace. Eden wasn't taken away forever, it was postponed. And that might just be the most hopeful reading of Genesis there is, because it means the story was never really about losing paradise. It was always about becoming the kind of people who are capable of living in it again. Thanks for watching.